The sun was setting as my truck rumbled down the long, winding dirt road leading to Shadow Hill. The forest closed in on both sides, the dense canopy turning the evening light into a dim, reddish glow that made everything look as if it were bathed in blood. I gripped the steering wheel, the list of rules sitting on the passenger seat beside me. My name is Samuel Carter, but everyone calls me Sam. A few months ago, I quit my job as a history teacher in Chicago. After a bitter divorce and a string of bad decisions, I needed a fresh start. When I saw the job posting for a caretaker at an old Civil War battlefield, it felt like fate. History had always fascinated me, and the thought of spending my days in solitude, surrounded by nature and the echoes of the past, was exactly what I needed. But as I approached the old iron gates of Shadow Hill, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest was too quiet, the air too still, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I parked my truck and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The previous caretaker, a hunched old man named Thomas, was waiting for me by the gate. His eyes were sunken, his hands trembling as he handed me a worn notebook. "You'll need this," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "These rules, they're not just for show. If you want to survive here, you follow them. No questions." I took the notebook, flipping through the pages filled with scribbled instructions. "What do you mean?" I asked, but Thomas was already backing away, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "You'll understand soon enough," he muttered. "Just, don't break the rules. Whatever you do." Before I could ask more, he was gone, leaving me alone at the entrance to the battlefield. I watched as his car sped down the road, disappearing into the shadows. Taking a deep breath, I turned toward the old battlefield. The land stretched out before me, a vast expanse of overgrown grass, crumbling stone walls, and ancient trees that had likely borne witness to the horrors of war. In the distance, I could see the outline of the old barracks and the chapel, their windows dark and foreboding. I opened the notebook again and read the first rule: if you see soldiers marching at night, look away and stay silent. It seemed absurd, like something out of a ghost story. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, I couldn't shake the chill that crept down my spine. Something about this place felt wrong. And I was about to find out just how wrong it truly was. The sun dipped behind the tree line, casting the battlefield in shadows as I made my way to the caretaker's cabin. The air had grown colder, with a damp chill that seeped into my bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling every time I glanced over my shoulder. The cabin was small but well kept, tucked away at the edge of the clearing near the old barracks. It had a porch with a rocking chair, a single flickering lantern, and a view that looked out over the sprawling battlefield. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I was greeted by the musty scent of old wood and dust. The only sound was the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath my boots. I set my bags down and took a deep breath. I'd been looking forward to the solitude, the quiet, the chance to clear my mind. But now, with the encroaching darkness and the strange notebook filled with rules, my optimism was quickly fading. I pulled out the notebook that the previous caretaker, Thomas, had given me and set it on the small, rickety table in the corner. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, some of it smudged as if written in haste. The first page listed the rules I had skimmed through earlier, but now, in the quiet stillness of the cabin, I read them more carefully. Rule number 1. If you see soldiers marching at night, look away and stay silent. Rule number 2. Do not light a fire after midnight. Rule number 3. If you hear the sound of drumming, do not investigate. Rule number 4. Never enter the forest after dusk. Rule number 5. If you find a letter addressed to Dearest Lily, leave it where you found it. Rule number 6. If you hear crying near the old chapel, keep walking and do not respond. Rule number 7. At dawn, always make sure the flag in front of the old barracks is raised. If it is not, raise it yourself. The words were absurd. Who would leave such a list? But the fear in Thomas's eyes as he handed me the notebook haunted me. What had he seen? What had driven him to flee so quickly? As darkness settled over the battlefield, I decided to familiarize myself with the grounds before turning in for the night. Armed with a flashlight and a map I'd found in the cabin, I stepped outside, locking the door behind me. The air was thick with mist that clung to the earth, turning the distant trees into shadowy sentinels. I walked along the main path, which led past the old barracks, the dilapidated chapel, and a series of stone markers that indicated where soldiers had fallen. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. It was quiet, unnaturally so. Not a single bird or insect disturbed the stillness. As I rounded a bend near the old barracks, I noticed something strange, a faint glow in the distance. Squinting, I could just make out the shapes of figures moving in the mist. Soldiers. They were dressed in tattered uniforms, their faces obscured by the shadows. They marched in unison, their boots making no sound as they moved across the field. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. If you see soldiers marching at night, look away and stay silent. I forced myself to turn away, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight. I bit my lip, resisting the urge to look back, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the ground, my breath coming in shallow gasps. After what felt like an eternity, the air around me lightened, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I dared to glance over my shoulder. The soldiers were gone, the battlefield once again empty. I hurried back to the cabin, my pulse still racing. As I locked the door behind me, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, a combination of fog and shadows that my tired mind had misinterpreted. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Those soldiers had felt real, too real. I sat at the table, the flickering lantern casting long shadows across the walls. My hands shook as I flipped through the notebook again. Why were there so many rules? And what happened if I broke one? Before I could contemplate further, a loud thunk echoed from the direction of the old barracks, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. My skin prickled with fear. If you hear the sound of drumming, do not investigate. But it wasn't drumming, it was something else, something that sounded almost human. I hesitated, gripping the flashlight, the urge to check it out battling with the warning in the notebook. I had to know what it was. I grabbed my jacket and cautiously opened the door, the cold night air washing over me. The sound grew louder as I approached the barracks, a rhythmic banging, almost like the sound of fists pounding on wood. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The air seemed to swallow the sound, making it feel like I was yelling into a void. As I drew closer, the noise stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I hesitated at the entrance, staring into the pitch-black interior of the old building. My flashlight flickered, casting sporadic beams of light that only deepened the shadows. "Is someone there?" I asked, taking a cautious step inside. But there was no response, just the echo of my own footsteps. I moved deeper into the darkness, the smell of mold and decay growing stronger. That's when I saw it, a single, folded piece of yellowed paper lying on the ground, illuminated by the faint moonlight streaming through a broken window. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The paper was brittle, as if it had been there for decades. Scrawled across it in elegant handwriting were the words, "Dearest Lily, I will find my way back to you." Rule number 5. If you find a letter addressed to "Dearest Lily," leave it where you found it. A chill ran down my spine. The urge to keep the letter and read more was almost overwhelming. But the rules were clear. I carefully placed the letter back on the ground and turned to leave. As I made my way out of the barracks, I heard a soft whisper, like someone breathing directly into my ear, "You should have kept it." I broke into a run, not stopping until I was safely back in the cabin, my heart pounding. I locked the door and slid down to the floor, trying to calm my ragged breathing. The battlefield was more than just haunted, it was alive, filled with things that shouldn't exist. Exhausted but unable to sleep, I lay on the narrow cot, listening to the wind howling outside. Every creak of the old cabin sent my heart racing. I kept the notebook on the nightstand beside me, the lantern turned down low. Then I heard it, a faint, mournful crying coming from outside. It was a woman's voice, the sound so filled with despair that it sent chills racing down my spine. Rule number 6: if you hear crying near the old chapel, keep walking and do not respond. The sound grew louder, as if whoever was crying was moving closer to the cabin. My throat tightened, my body frozen in fear. I wanted to go to the window, to see who was out there, but I knew better now. I couldn't break another rule. "Please, help me," the voice whimpered, right outside my door now, each word choked with sobs. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, willing the voice to go away. But it was relentless, pleading, begging for help. It took every ounce of willpower I had to remain silent. Then, as quickly as it started, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the sound itself, like the world was holding its breath. I remained still for what felt like hours before exhaustion finally took over. But as I drifted into a fitful sleep, the whispers and cries seemed to linger at the edges of my dreams, reminding me that the horrors of Shadow Hill were far from over. The next morning, I woke up drenched in sweat. The sunlight streaming through the cabin windows did little to banish the memories of the previous night. The cries, the marching soldiers, and the ghostly whisper near the barracks, each echoed in my mind like a sinister refrain. I felt as if I had only barely survived some unseen trial, and I knew that if I made even one mistake, I might not live to see another sunrise. The notebook lay on the nightstand beside me, its pages now more ominous than ever. I had scoffed at the rules at first, dismissing them as the ravings of a madman. But after what I had seen and heard, I wasn't so sure anymore. Each rule was starting to feel like a lifeline, the only thing keeping me from being swallowed whole by whatever haunted Shadow Hill. I got dressed, threw on my jacket, and stepped outside. The early morning fog hung heavy over the battlefield, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. The trees, blackened by years of weather and age, loomed like sentinels guarding some long-forgotten secret. As I made my way toward the old barracks, I tried to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled in my chest. Today's task was simple. I had to raise the flag in front of the barracks, just as rule number 7 instructed. The flagpole stood crookedly near the crumbling stone building, its rope swaying gently in the breeze. But as I approached, I heard it, the faint, steady sound of drumming. My heart leapt into my throat. Rule number 3: if you hear the sound of drumming, do not investigate. The drumming was distant at first, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the forest that bordered the battlefield. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the task at hand. I reached the flagpole, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled on the rope to raise the faded, tattered flag. But the drumming grew louder, its rhythm slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of some ancient beast. With each beat, the ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate. It was like the earth itself was resonating with the sound. I forced myself to stay focused. Just get the flag up and leave, I told myself, but the drumming was relentless, filling my ears until it was all I could hear. It was hypnotic, like it was trying to draw me closer, to pull me into the depths of the forest. I finished raising the flag, tying the rope securely, and turned to leave. But as I did, the drumming abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden, so complete, that it was like the world had been plunged into a vacuum. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper right behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the fog and the swaying branches of the dead trees. The whisper echoed in my mind, chilling me to the bone. My instinct was to run, to get back to the safety of the cabin, but I forced myself to walk calmly, not wanting to give whatever was out there the satisfaction of seeing my fear. Back at the cabin, I tried to calm my racing heart. I sat down at the small wooden table and pored over the old journals and letters I had found the night before. Most of them were the ramblings of previous caretakers, scribbled notes about strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and desperate pleas for help. One journal entry, dated nearly 20 years ago, caught my eye. "The drumming is getting louder." I tried to ignore it, just as the rules say, but it's getting harder. I fear that if I listen for too long, I'll lose myself to the rhythm. Last night, I saw them again, soldiers marching through the mist, their faces twisted in agony. They looked at me, their hollow eyes pleading for release. But I can't help them. I'm trapped here, just like they are. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged as if the writer's hands had been trembling. I couldn't help but wonder if this caretaker had eventually broken one of the rules. And if so, what had happened to him? As I flipped through the pages, I found another letter addressed to Lily. The same name I had seen on the letter in the barracks. This one was written in a flowing script, clearly from a soldier. "My dearest Lily, the war rages on, and I fear I may never see your face again. But if fate is kind, I will find my way back to you, no matter the cost. Please wait for me." The ink was faded, the paper brittle, but the emotion behind the words was still palpable. Whoever had written it had died on these grounds, that much was clear. I couldn't shake the feeling that the souls of these soldiers were still searching for something, or someone. I was so engrossed in the letter that I didn't notice the shadow moving past the window until it was too late. I looked up just in time to see a figure in a tattered uniform disappear into the fog. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped outside, scanning the tree line. But there was nothing there, only the swaying branches and the distant sound of wind rustling through the leaves. I decided to take a walk along the perimeter of the battlefield, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The forest that bordered the grounds was dense, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. As I approached the tree line, I remembered rule number 4, never enter the forest after dusk. But it was still daylight, barely. I checked my watch. It was 4:30 p.m., so I figured I still had some time before the rule applied. But the closer I got to the forest, the heavier the air seemed to become. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the light, and the temperature dropped sharply. I stopped just short of the tree line, peering into the darkness beyond. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of light, like a lantern swaying in the breeze. I squinted, trying to make out the shape, but it vanished before I could be sure of what I had seen. "Come closer," a soft voice drifted through the trees, barely more than a whisper. "We need your help." I turned to leave, but as I did, I felt something cold brush against my arm. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the fog and the trees. My pulse quickened, and I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the darkness. By the time I returned to the main path, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched across the battlefield. The old chapel loomed in the distance, its broken windows reflecting the dying light. I knew better than to go near it, especially after the cries I'd heard last night, but something about the building seemed to call to me. I stopped in my tracks, shaking my head. "No. You can't break another rule." But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, a faint sobbing, like a child lost in the dark. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to keep walking. The rules were there for a reason. But as I quickened my pace, the crying grew louder, more desperate, like it was following me. "Please," a voice whimpered, right behind me. "Help me." My resolve nearly broke, but I kept my eyes forward, my hands trembling. Whatever it wasn't human. And if I turned around, I knew it would be waiting for me. Finally, I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. The crying stopped instantly, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I locked every window and door, praying that whatever was out there couldn't get in. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the slow, steady drumming. It was closer this time, as if the source was right outside the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, and I clutched the notebook tightly, reminding myself of the rules. Do not investigate. But the drumming grew louder, more insistent, rattling the very walls of the cabin. I buried my head under the pillow, trying to drown out the sound, but it was no use. It was like the drumming was inside my skull, reverberating through every bone in my body. I don't know how long it lasted, minutes, hours, but eventually, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was as if the entire world had stopped breathing, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as I was beginning to drift into a restless sleep, I heard the whisper again. The whisper lingered in the air like a foul stench. "Tomorrow, we will take what you owe us." I jolted upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribcage. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and the room was so cold that my breath came out in visible puffs. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But the cold touch of fear gripping my chest told me this was no dream. The battlefield wanted something from me, and whatever it was, it would not wait much longer. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 3 a.m. The witching hour. The battlefield seemed to come alive during these dark hours, as if the spirits of the dead soldiers grew restless, their anger intensifying with each passing night. I knew I couldn't go back to sleep, not with the threat of whatever had whispered to me still fresh in my mind. I tried to distract myself by reading through the notebook again, hoping to find something I'd missed. But the rules were as cryptic as ever, leaving me with more questions than answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden message buried within the lines, something Thomas, the previous caretaker, had tried to convey. A sudden, loud bang against the window startled me, causing me to drop the notebook. I turned toward the sound, flashlight in hand, but the glass was covered in thick frost, making it impossible to see outside. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I forced myself to move closer. As I reached the window, I saw it, a handprint pressed against the glass, slowly fading as the frost consumed it. But the handprint was not human. The fingers were elongated, twisted, as if they belonged to something that had once been human but had long since become something else. "This place is breaking me," I muttered to myself, trying to steady my shaking hands. But I couldn't deny it anymore. The rules were not just guidelines, they were the thin line between life and whatever nightmare waited beyond. Dawn was finally breaking, painting the sky a muted gray that barely pierced through the thick fog clinging to the battlefield. I had survived another night, but the sense of dread hanging over me had only grown stronger. Rule number 7 was clear. At dawn, always make sure the flag in front of the old barracks is raised. I was becoming familiar with this ritual, one of the few tasks that made me feel somewhat grounded in reality. But as I made my way to the barracks that morning, the fog seemed thicker than ever, muffling my footsteps and turning the familiar path into a maze. When I reached the flagpole, I found it tangled in its rope, as if someone, or something, had tried to pull it down during the night. My hands were stiff with cold as I untangled the mess and raised the flag. As I did, the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, like the earth itself was groaning in protest. But the moment the flag was raised, the oppressive weight lifted. The air grew lighter, and the fog began to dissipate. It was as if the battlefield itself had been appeased, at least for the moment. Satisfied that I had followed the rule, I turned to head back to the cabin. That's when I saw it, a dark figure standing at the entrance to the old chapel, watching me. My blood ran cold. The figure was dressed in a ragged soldier's uniform, its features obscured by shadows. For a moment, I thought it was another apparition, like the marching soldiers I'd seen before. But then it moved, stepping forward as if it intended to cross the field toward me. Rule number 6 echoed in my mind: if you hear crying near the old chapel, keep walking and do not respond. But there was no crying this time, only the heavy, watchful presence of that figure. I turned on my heel and forced myself to walk back to the cabin, my steps quickening with every second. I could feel its gaze burning into my back, a weight that grew heavier with each step I took. But I didn't dare look back. Not until I was safely behind the locked door of my cabin. By the time I reached the safety of the cabin, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I had followed every rule to the letter, yet the spirits, or whatever they were, seemed to be getting bolder. I couldn't keep this up forever. I needed answers. And I was beginning to suspect that the chapel held the key. I had avoided the chapel since that first night, the memory of the cries and whispers still fresh in my mind. But if I was going to survive whatever was coming, I had to find out what was hidden there. Maybe there was something that Thomas hadn't told me, something that could explain why the spirits seemed to be growing more restless. I waited until noon, the only time of day when the battlefield seemed to relax its grip. The sun was at its highest point, casting a weak light that barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees surrounding the chapel. I grabbed my flashlight, a heavy crowbar for protection, and set off toward the dilapidated building. The chapel loomed ahead, its rotting wooden beams creaking in the wind. Vines had overtaken the stone walls, and the stained glass windows were cracked and darkened with age. As I pushed open the heavy, wooden door, the smell of damp earth and decay filled my nostrils. Inside, the chapel was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears until it felt like they might burst. Dust motes danced in the weak beams of sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. The pews were covered in a thick layer of grime, and the altar at the far end was draped in cobwebs. I made my way down the center aisle, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. My flashlight beam swept across the empty pews, revealing the faint outlines of old bloodstains and what looked like scratched messages etched into the wood. "Help us, trapped forever, and no escape." The words were desperate, carved by someone who had clearly lost their mind. My pulse quickened as I realized these messages must have been left by the previous caretakers, or perhaps the souls of the soldiers who had died here. I approached the altar, where an ancient, leather-bound book lay open, its pages yellowed and crumbling. As I reached out to touch it, a sudden gust of wind slammed the chapel door shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and the familiar sound of sobbing filled the air. It was closer this time, coming from just behind the altar. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure crouched in the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. Lily, the voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but filled with a deep, aching sorrow. I hesitated. Rule number 6, if you hear crying near the old chapel, keep walking and do not respond. But this time, the voice was different. It was pleading, desperate, like someone who had been trapped for far too long. Against my better judgment, I moved closer, shining my flashlight into the darkness behind the altar. That's when I saw it, a tattered letter clutched in a skeletal hand, reaching out from the shadows. The letter was addressed to Lily once again, but this time, it was accompanied by a single word scrawled in blood across the page: forgive. A wave of dizziness hit me, and the room seemed to spin. The air was filled with the scent of smoke and blood, as if the horrors of the battlefield were coming to life around me. The cries grew louder, the sound of drums and distant gunfire echoing through the chapel. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run before it was too late. But as I turned to flee, the skeletal hand grabbed my ankle, its grip like a vice. I screamed, kicking desperately to free myself, but it only tightened its hold. "Please, help me," the voice whispered, and for a moment, I felt a surge of empathy. This wasn't just a ghost. It was a soul trapped in a cycle of pain, unable to move on. But I couldn't help it. I tore myself free and bolted out of the chapel, slamming the door behind me. The cries continued, muffled by the thick wooden door, as I sprinted back to the cabin. As I collapsed onto the floor of the cabin, gasping for breath, I noticed a new entry in the notebook that I was sure hadn't been there before. "You broke the rule. The soldiers are coming." A cold dread settled over me. I had let my curiosity and empathy get the better of me, and now I would have to face the consequences. Outside, the sound of marching boots echoed through the fog, growing louder with every second. The battlefield was waking up, and it was hungry. And this time, it was coming for me. I don't know how long I lay on the cold wooden floor, catching my breath after barely escaping the chapel. The marching boots outside the cabin grew louder, the sound of countless feet hitting the ground in unison. I knew I had broken one of the rules, and now, the battlefield spirits were coming for me. My mind raced with the new, ominous message that had appeared in the notebook. You broke the rule. The soldiers are coming. There was no time to think, no time to strategize. I needed to find a way out before they reached the cabin. Grabbing the flashlight and my jacket, I bolted for the back door, leaving behind the only place that had offered me some semblance of safety. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. The fog was thicker than ever, turning the landscape into a blurred nightmare. The sound of marching was closer now, echoing all around me, as if the spirits were circling in for the kill. There was only one place left to go, the forest. Rule number 4, never enter the forest after dusk. I had followed that rule religiously, but now it seemed like the lesser of two evils. If the soldiers were coming for me, maybe the dense woods would offer some cover. I sprinted toward the tree line, ignoring the growing dread in my gut. As I crossed the threshold into the forest, the air grew colder, the fog clinging to me like icy fingers. The trees stood like ancient sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as if to pull me deeper into their shadows. The moment I entered, the sound of marching soldiers vanished, replaced by an unnatural silence that pressed in on all sides. For a moment, I dared to hope that the soldiers couldn't follow me here, that maybe the forest was beyond their reach. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into something far worse. The forest had its own presence, its own hunger. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The last rays of twilight vanished, leaving me with only the weak beam of my flashlight to guide me. Every step I took seemed to be absorbed by the thick layer of dead leaves covering the ground, muffling any sound I made. As I pushed through the dense underbrush, the trees around me began to change. Their bark was covered in strange, pulsing growths that looked like veins. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the ground beneath my feet felt soft, like I was walking on a sponge. Then, the whispering began. "Turn back, you don't belong here." The voices seemed to come from all directions, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. Some were angry, others pleading, but all of them carried the same underlying message: leave. I tried to ignore them, forcing myself to move deeper into the forest. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind until it was hard to think. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, my flashlight flickering as if it were struggling to stay alive. The trees began to close in, their branches like twisted arms reaching out to grab me. I swore I could see faces in the bark, hollow-eyed, twisted with anguish. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to come alive, like it was aware of my presence and eager to consume me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I stumbled into a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the gaps in the trees, casting an eerie glow over the space. At the center of the clearing stood a figure, a woman dressed in a tattered white gown, her back turned to me. My breath hitched. She looked human, but something about the way she stood, unnaturally still, sent chills down my spine. The wind didn't seem to touch her, her long, dark hair hung motionless, as if frozen in time. "Lily?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The woman turned slowly, her movements stiff, mechanical. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to draw in all the light around her. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as she spoke, her voice a blend of anguish and malice. "You broke the rules, Samuel," she said. "Now you must pay." Before I could react, the ground beneath me shifted. Roots burst forth from the earth, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me down. I screamed, struggling to free myself, but the roots were relentless, tightening with each passing second. Lily, or whatever she had become, floated closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "You were supposed to help us," she hissed. "Instead, you brought more suffering." The roots pulled me deeper into the earth, the cold soil swallowing my legs. In a moment of desperation, I reached for the flashlight, shining it directly into her eyes. She recoiled, hissing like a cornered animal. The roots loosened just enough for me to tear myself free and sprint back into the darkness of the forest. I ran until my lungs burned, the whispers in the trees turning into anguished wails. I didn't dare look back, terrified that Lily, or whatever entity she had become, was still following me. As I emerged from the forest, I found myself on the edge of the battlefield again. Gasping for breath, I collapsed against one of the ancient stone markers. My hands were shaking, my mind racing to process what had just happened. The forest was alive, and it wanted something from me, something I couldn't begin to understand. But as I caught my breath, I realized I wasn't alone. Standing a few feet away was the figure of a soldier, his uniform tattered and stained with blood. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and filled with a silent plea. "You were warned," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You broke the rules. Now, we all suffer." He turned and pointed toward the old chapel, where a faint glow was emanating from within. The sound of crying echoed once more, louder and more desperate than before. The battlefield seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, like the spirits trapped here were on the verge of breaking free. As the soldier faded into the mist, I knew what I had to do. The spirits were growing more restless, their anger turning into a force that threatened to consume everything in its path. I had to go back to the chapel, to confront whatever was lurking within. I made my way through the battlefield, the mist swirling around my feet. The cries grew louder with each step, turning into screams of agony that pierced the air like knives. I reached the chapel, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The door creaked open on its own as I approached, revealing the dark interior within. The pews were filled with shadowy figures, their hollow eyes watching me as I entered. The altar at the front was drenched in a crimson light, and at its center stood Lily, her once beautiful face now a mask of rage. "You could have freed us," she spat, her voice echoing through the chapel. "But you chose fear. Now, you will suffer as we have suffered." The figures in the pews began to rise, their forms twisting and contorting as they moved toward me. I knew I couldn't fight them, not in the way I had fought the spirits before. But I remembered something I had read in the notebook: the spirits seek closure. They need to be heard, to have their pain acknowledged. Gathering my courage, I stepped forward. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I didn't understand. I didn't know what you needed." For a moment, the spirits paused, their eyes locked onto mine. Lily's face twisted with rage, but there was something else there, something that looked almost like hope. The crimson light dimmed, and the cries grew softer, as if the spirits were listening. I took another step forward, my hands shaking. "Tell me how I can help you," I pleaded. Lily's eyes softened, the rage in them dimming. "We are bound here by pain and betrayal," she whispered. "Free us, and you will be free." The room erupted into a deafening roar as the spirits surged toward me, their forms dissolving into mist. But instead of attacking, they flowed around me, enveloping me in their cold embrace. For a moment, it felt like I was drowning in darkness, but then, just as quickly, it was over. The chapel was empty. The battlefield was silent. And the notebook on the ground in front of me now had a final message. The rules are broken. The cycle ends tonight. The battlefield was eerily quiet as I stood alone in front of the old chapel. The once relentless cries, the marching soldiers, and the ominous drumming had all faded into an unsettling silence. The notebook's final message echoed in my mind: the rules are broken. The cycle ends tonight. What did that mean? And why had the spirits suddenly gone silent after I promised to help them? A part of me wanted to believe that I had freed them, that the nightmare was finally over. But deep down, I knew that Shadow Hill would not let me go so easily. I needed answers, and there was only one place left to search: the caretaker's cabin. I had avoided delving too deeply into the previous journals and letters stored there, too afraid of what I might find. But now, if I was going to survive whatever was coming, I had no choice. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of mildew and dust. The flickering lantern cast long shadows on the walls, making the room seem alive with the ghosts of its past occupants. The stack of journals and old letters on the small table had grown thicker over the years, a testament to the many caretakers who had tried, and failed, to uncover the secrets of Shadow Hill. I flipped through the journals, my hands shaking as I read the desperate scrawls of those who came before me. They told me I could end it. But they lied. The spirits are growing stronger. I can't hold them back much longer. Lily haunts my dreams. She begs for forgiveness, but I don't know how to give it. Each entry seemed to end the same way, with the caretaker slowly succumbing to madness. Some simply stopped writing, their final words trailing off into illegible scribbles. Others described hearing voices, seeing shadows that no one else could see, until they finally disappeared, claimed by the battlefield's curse. One particular entry caught my attention, dated nearly 50 years ago. The soldiers are not the only ones bound here. It was their commander, Colonel Abraham Blackwell, who cursed this land in his final moments. His obsession with victory, even at the cost of his own men, condemned them all. He vowed that none would rest until their revenge was complete. And Lily, she was the one who paid the price. My heart skipped a beat. This was the first mention of the name that had haunted me since I arrived. The letters, the whispers in the forest, the ghostly figure I had seen, Lily was at the center of it all. But who was she? And how was she connected to Colonel Blackwell? As I dug deeper, I found an old, brittle letter tucked inside one of the journals. It was addressed to a commanding officer during the war and written in a shaky hand. My dearest Lily, I fear that I will not return from this accursed battlefield. Colonel Blackwell has gone mad with power, ordering his men to fight to the last breath. He claims that victory will cleanse this land, but all it has done is stain it with more blood. If I do not survive, know that I loved you until my last breath. Please forgive me. The letter was signed by a Lieutenant James Thorne. It was dated just days before the final, brutal battle at Shadow Hill. The pieces began to fall into place. Lily was waiting for someone who never returned. And it was the colonel's twisted obsession that bound the souls of his men to this cursed ground. But there was more. As I turned the letter over, I found a scribbled note at the bottom. Lily was not just a lover, she was a healer. She tried to save the wounded soldiers, but Blackwell's men accused her of being a spy. She was killed, condemned to wander this battlefield for eternity, searching for the soul she couldn't save. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Lily wasn't just another spirit trapped here, she was the key. Her soul was bound to this place by the cruelty and betrayal of the men she had tried to help. And now, she was seeking revenge. The notebook's warning echoed in my mind. The cycle would end tonight, but it would come at a cost. If I was going to break the curse, I had to confront Colonel Blackwell and help Lily find peace. But how? Then, it hit me, rule number 7, at dawn, always make sure the flag in front of the old barracks is raised. If it is not, raise it yourself. The flag. It had been a ritual I followed every morning, never questioning why. But what if it was more than just a rule? What if it was a way to keep the spirits contained? The journal entries mentioned that the flag symbolized a ceasefire, a temporary truce that kept the spirits at bay. But with the rules broken, the spirits were free to exact their vengeance. If I could raise the flag before dawn, perhaps I could buy enough time to find Lily and end the curse once and for all. As I stepped outside, the air was thick with the scent of rain, and the sky was filled with ominous clouds. The soldiers marching had returned, louder and more relentless than ever. The ground seemed to tremble beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the old barracks, the flagpole barely visible through the swirling mist. The battlefield was alive with shadows. The soldiers who had once marched silently now moved with purpose, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Their faces were twisted with rage, their hands clutching ghostly rifles as they advanced toward the barracks. I reached the flagpole, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the ropes. The flag was tattered and torn, its colors faded, but it still held the power to keep the spirits at bay, if I could raise it in time. But as I pulled on the rope, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Colonel Blackwell standing behind me, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you can undo what I have wrought?" he hissed. His voice was like gravel, a terrible sound that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm not here to stop you," I gasped, struggling to free myself from his iron grip. I'm here to free them." For a moment, Blackwell's expression faltered, confusion flickering in his eyes. I took advantage of the moment, yanking on the rope with all my strength. The flag began to rise, its colors catching the first light of dawn. The soldiers halted, their eyes turning toward the flag. For a brief moment, the battlefield was silent. The spirits seemed to pause, their rage giving way to something else, something that looked like hope. But Blackwell was not done with me yet. He lunged forward, his skeletal hand closing around my throat. "You cannot end this," he roared. "I will not be denied my victory." As darkness began to creep into my vision, I saw her, Lily, standing at the edge of the battlefield, her eyes locked onto mine. She raised her hand, and a brilliant light erupted from her palm, enveloping the battlefield in a blinding glow. The colonel screamed, his form dissolving into shadows as Lily's light consumed him. The soldiers, too, began to fade, their tortured expressions softening as they were released from the curse. When the light finally faded, I found myself alone on the battlefield. The flag flapped gently in the morning breeze, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the clouds. The oppressive weight that had hung over the battlefield was gone, replaced by a peaceful stillness. I turned to where Lily had stood, but she was gone. All that remained was a single, tattered letter at my feet. I picked it up and read the final words. "Thank you, Samuel. The cycle is broken. We are free." Tears filled my eyes as I realized what had happened. Lily had forgiven those who had wronged her, and in doing so, she had freed herself and the soldiers bound to this place. The curse of Shadow Hill had finally been broken. Exhausted, I made my way back to the cabin. The battlefield that had once been filled with the cries of the damned was now silent, a place of rest rather than torment. I packed my bags, ready to leave Shadow Hill behind forever. As I walked toward my truck, I glanced back one last time. The flag was still raised, fluttering in the gentle breeze. For the first time since I had arrived, I felt a sense of peace. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow Hill wasn't quite done with me. The notebook still lay on the seat beside me, its pages now blank. And as the last of the mist cleared, I thought I saw a figure standing on the edge of the forest, watching me. As I drove away from the battlefield, the morning sun rose higher, casting warm light over the dense trees that lined the winding road. For the first time since I had arrived at Shadow Hill, I felt a small sliver of hope. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight that had clung to me for weeks finally lifting. I had broken the curse, I had freed the souls that had been trapped for over a century. But as the miles ticked by and the battlefield faded into the distance, that sliver of hope began to wane. The notebook still sat on the passenger seat, its pages blank and yet somehow menacing. I couldn't understand it. If the cycle was truly broken, why hadn't it disappeared like everything else? Why was it still with me, like a lingering shadow? I pushed the thoughts aside, trying to focus on the road ahead. I was exhausted, my body aching from the night's ordeals, but the thought of finally leaving Shadow Hill behind kept me going. I just had to make it through one last stretch of forest, and I would be free. But freedom, as I was about to learn, is never that simple. The forest seemed darker now, even though the sun was shining. The trees crowded the road on either side, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further I drove, the more the light seemed to dim, until it felt like dusk had returned despite the early hour. That's when I noticed it, a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror. I glanced back, expecting to see an animal or perhaps a trick of the light. But instead, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, far behind me. My blood ran cold. It was the unmistakable silhouette of a soldier in a tattered uniform, his face obscured by shadows. I turned my eyes back to the road, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It was impossible. I had broken the curse. I had freed them all. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the unease gnawing at my stomach told me otherwise. The figure was gone when I checked the mirror again, but the sense of dread remained. The forest around me seemed to shift and writhe, as if the trees themselves were alive, watching my every move. I drove faster, the engine whining as I pushed the truck to its limits. I needed to get out of this forest, out of the shadow of Shadow Hill. But the further I drove, the more the road seemed to twist and turn back on itself, like I was driving in circles. The oppressive silence that had once filled the battlefield was now all around me. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just the sound of my truck's engine and the relentless thumping of my heart. Suddenly, the truck's radio crackled to life, filling the cab with a burst of static. I hadn't turned it on, and the dials spun wildly as if someone, or something, was trying to find a station. "Samuel," a voice crackled through the static, distorted and filled with anguish. "You cannot escape." It was Lily's voice. The same voice that had whispered to me in the forest, that had pleaded for help in the chapel. But this time, it was filled with a cold, desperate rage. "You thought you could break the curse," she hissed, her voice warping with static. "But you are still bound to us. You always were." The radio cut out, plunging the truck back into silence. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I had done everything they had asked. I had freed the spirits, broken the cycle. But Lily's words lingered in my mind. "You are still bound to us." I pressed down harder on the gas pedal, willing the truck to move faster. But as I rounded a bend in the road, the truck suddenly lurched to a stop, the engine dying with a sputter. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic clawed at my throat as I tried to restart the engine, but it refused to turn over. The radio crackled back to life, and this time, it was not a voice that came through, but the sound of marching boots, a steady, relentless rhythm that seemed to surround me. The soldiers were back. I grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped out of the truck, my breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. The road ahead was swallowed by darkness, and the forest on either side seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I shone the flashlight into the woods, but all it revealed were the twisted shapes of trees, their branches moving as if they were alive. The marching grew louder, closing in on me from all sides. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and decay, the smell of old blood that had soaked into the earth. "Samuel," the voice was a whisper now, coming from just behind me. I turned, swinging the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw her, Lily. She stood on the edge of the forest, her white gown tattered and stained, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She was no longer the tragic spirit I had tried to help. She had become something darker, twisted by centuries of pain and betrayal. "You thought you could leave," she said, her voice soft and mocking. "But you belong to this land now. Just like the rest. What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I did what you asked. I freed you." Lily's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged to belong to a human. "You cannot free what was never meant to be free," she said. "You broke the rules, Samuel. And now, you must pay the price." The marching grew deafening, the sound of drums joining in as if the entire battlefield had come to life. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, they appeared, soldiers in tattered uniforms, their eyes glowing, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of rage. They surrounded me, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence. The air was thick with their hatred, their thirst for vengeance. I was trapped, caught in the cycle that I thought I had broken. In that moment of utter despair, the notebook in my jacket pocket grew hot, burning against my skin. I pulled it out, and to my shock, the once blank pages were now filled with new writing. The only way to end this is to make a choice. One must stay to keep the others at bay. The land demands a caretaker. You were chosen. A horrifying realization settled over me. The curse was never truly broken. The spirits had been bound to the land, yes, but they had always needed someone to anchor them, a caretaker to keep them from spilling into the world beyond. I was never meant to free them. I was meant to replace the last caretaker, to take his place in an endless cycle of suffering. Lily stepped forward, her eyes now softening, almost pleading. "Choose, Samuel," she whispered. "Stay, and the others will rest. Refuse, and we will haunt you until the end of your days." The soldiers watched me, their hollow eyes burning with the hope of release. They had been bound to this battlefield for centuries, and they would not let me go easily. Tears filled my eyes. I didn't want to be trapped here forever. But the alternative. I couldn't live with the constant torment, the relentless pursuit of the dead. I had seen what had happened to the caretakers before me. I would rather face oblivion than be condemned to that fate. But as I looked into Lily's eyes, I saw the pain and desperation of someone who had been betrayed, someone who had once tried to save others and had been damned for it. Could I, in my selfishness, condemn her again? With a heavy heart, I closed my eyes and made my choice. The forest fell silent. The marching stopped. When I opened my eyes, the soldiers were gone, and Lily was nowhere to be seen. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew still. The notebook in my hands had only one line left. "Welcome, caretaker. The land is yours now." As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, I realized what I had done. I had taken on the role I was always meant to fulfill. The spirits were at rest, but only for as long as I stayed. The curse would begin again if I ever tried to leave. I walked back to the truck, knowing it would start now that I had accepted my fate. But I no longer had a destination. Shadow Hill was my home. The spirits were my charges. And I was bound to this place until the next poor soul came along to take my place. As I walked back toward the battlefield, the sun rising over the fog, I heard it, the faint sound of drums, waiting for the day they would call me once more. The cycle was broken, but it had begun anew. And this time, there was no escape.